He prayed fervently that they would defend with all their might the worthy and pious superior of their mission against the persecution and encroachments of Anglican Protestants, who could not be regarded as true brothers in Christ because of heresies and lack of apostolic succession. It would be interesting to know that were the reactions of the simple and uneducated French and Belgian settlers in the north of Wisconsin to this pastoral letter from a Russian Orthodox bishop nearly 2,000 miles away on the coast of California, few of them could have understood a word of it. Bishop Grafton naturally was furious. He lost no time in writing to Villatte that if he were an honest man, he must do one of three things. 1. Return to a loving and loyal obedience to him. 2. Take a letter of transfer to the Archbishop of Utrecht or to Bishop Vladimir. Or 3. Leave the country. On April 13, 1891, he suspended him for a period of 6 months from all priestly ministrations of all kinds whatsoever. Villatte merely replied that he did not recognize Grafton's authority and that he refused to leave the mission. On May 9th, Bishop Vladimir used an official document in which he stated, "By the grace of God and the authority bestowed on me by the apostolic succession, I, Vladimir, Bishop of the Orthodox Catholic Church, announce to all clergymen of different Christian denominations and to all Old Catholics that the Reverend Joseph Rene Villatte, Superior of the Old Catholic Parish of Dykesville, Wisconsin, is now a true Old Catholic Orthodox Christian under the patronage of our Church, and no bishop or priest of any denomination has the right to interdict him or to suspend his religious duties, except the Holy Synod of the Russian Church, and myself. Any action contrary to this declaration is null and void, on the basis of liberty of conscience and the laws of this country." From the worldly point of view, it was tragic that Vladimir did not manage to control Villatte. Had it been possible to raise him to the episcopate, his exceptional gifts might have proved extremely valuable to what at that date was perhaps the most Erastian Christian body in the world. Had he found his way to Russia, he might even have rivaled Gregory Efimovich Rasputin as a sinister influence on church and state. For if necessary, he too could surround himself with an air of mysticism, and some people were unable to resist his plausible personality. Both Rasputin and Villatte were of peasant origin. Vladimir's assumption of jurisdiction over the length and breadth of the United States may have alarmed Grafton, even making him fear that the Oberprocutor of the Holy Synod might yet prove a greater menace to freedom in the Diocese of Fond du Lac than either the Bishop of Rome or the Archbishop of Utrecht. But there was little he could do about it, except to publish further warnings, describing him as a swindler who kept bad company, and whose associates, some of whom he mentioned by name, were his equals in crime and debauchery, which was the first mention of this sort of thing. It was one of these men referred to by Grafton, a certain Harding, formerly a member of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate and a missionary in India, but who had ceased to be a practicing Catholic, who inspired Villatte to pursue a line of action which might prove more to his advantage than remaining under the protection of the Russian bishop of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. The story told was as follows. In 1888, about 5,000 Catholics of the Latin Rite in Ceylon and South India had formed a schismatic body known as the Independent Catholic Church of Ceylon, Goa, and India. The reasons for this break with the papacy were political rather than religious. From the 16th century, there had existed a concordat between the Holy See and the King of Portugal, which allowed the latter to nominate bishops to the Diocese of the Latin Rite in India, as well as in all other countries which had formerly been Portuguese colonies. This arrangement was known as the patronado, patronage. By the second half of the 19th century, it had become obvious that it was high time for the patronado to be abolished. On January 2nd, 1887, Leo XIII set up a new Latin hierarchy for India and Ceylon, with the bishops, except in the province of Goa, directly dependent on the Congregation of Propaganda. This change aroused considerable indignation, because there still existed a strong sentimental link between Indian Catholics and Portugal. Many native priests were indignant indignant at being transferred to the jurisdiction of French or Italian bishops. Thus came into being what was called the Patronato Association. Its leaders petitioned King Louis I of Portugal to use his influence at Rome to have the royal patronage restored. On February 10, 1888, a Goan priest who had been a Brahmin, Antonio Francisco Javier Alvarez, was elected by the association as first bishop of a schismatic church. He applied to Mar Dionysios V, Jacobite Metropolitan of Malankara since 1876, to consecrate him, but with no result. His appeal to Mar Ignatius Peter III, Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, was more successful. Realizing that there was no further hope of being raised to the episcopate by any of the old Catholic bishops in Europe, and possibly doubtful of the prospects of preferment in communion with the Patriarchate of Moscow, since he had no further word of this from Vladimir, Vilat decided to write to Alvarez, who now styled himself Mar Julius I, and Metropolitan of the Independent Catholic Church of Ceylon, Goa, and India, asking if he would be willing to consecrate him. The answer to the request, dated May 10, 1891, was so expressed as to make Vilat feel that, at long last, he had found a prelate after his own heart and a kindred spirit. Alvarez wrote, "We from the bottom of our hearts thank God that he has mercifully shown us the way out of the slavery of Rome, and we rejoice to see a large number of Christians making heroic efforts in the same direction as ourselves in the New World, and we feel confident that the good God will deign to mercifully help these holy endeavors. If the necessary arrangements could be made, we would overlook the hardships connected with the voyage, and go across the seas to confer the episcopate on such a worthy minister of God as yourself, particularly as Dr. Lisbeth Pinto urges us in the strongest terms to forget everything and think of America." Vilat replied that it would be better if he went to Ceylon, which would save Alvarez the hardships of going to North America. It is more than likely that he did not want his Brahmin prelate to discover that there were actually very few Christians in the United States who were desperate to free themselves from the slavery of Rome. In a second letter, Alvarez said that he would be delighted to welcome the worthy minister of God from Wisconsin. No time was wasted. Vilat placed his old Catholic missions under the care of a certain Brother Augustine, apparently the same person as Harding, and explained to his flock the reasons for making the long voyage to the Far East. They were as follows. 1. Because the old Catholics in America were forbidden by the Archbishop and bishops in Holland to present their candidates to Anglican bishops for confirmation, or to use holy oils blessed by them. 2. The fear that in the case of his death, his people would be without pastoral care, in which case he would be responsible should they be compelled to submit to Roman Catholic bishops. 3. The long silence of the Holy Synod of Moscow and the apparent indifference of the Orthodox Church towards the old Catholic movement in North America. 4. The expressed orthodoxy of the Independent Catholic Church of Ceylon, together with the urgent invitation to go there and receive the apostolic succession. There is a story that before leaving Green Bay, Vilat held a synod at which he was elected bishop, and begged to obtain an indisputable episcopal consecration as soon as possible. Bishop Grafton's version of this legend was slightly different, for he told a story that Vilat carried around a paper amongst the few, poor ignorant people under his charge, which he demanded they should sign. Most of them compiled, some of them little children. There was only one clergyman's name on this petition, and that, according to the statement of the clergyman so named, was forged. This accusation may or may not be true, but Vilat recorded that the poor people around Dykesville donated $225 towards the expenses of his voyage to Ceylon. For the sake of economy, he had to travel third class on the steamer. He sailed from New York on July 15, 1891, and was away from North America for over a year. It was not until May 29, 1892, that Mar Julius felt justified in raising this freelance French priest, now an American citizen, to the episcopate, for he took the precaution to consult the Patriarch Ignatius Peter III of Antioch. There was a long delay before his reply reached Ceylon. The ceremony finally took place in the former Portuguese Catholic Church of Our Lady of Good Death, Colombo, which the schismatics had managed to retain. Mar Julius was assisted by his own consecrator, Mar Paul Athanasius, Bishop of Kottayam, and Mar George Gregorius, Bishop of Niranum. The Roman pontifical was used. In the alleged bull of His Holiness Peter III, signed and sealed from the patriarchal palace at the Monasterio Sapran at Mardin on the borders of Syria and Kurdistan on December 29, 1891, the consecration of Joseph René Villatte was granted for the archiepiscopal dignity. Archbishop Metropolitan in the name of Mar Timotheos for the Church of the Mother of God in Dykesville, Wisconsin, United States, and the churches of the Archdiocese of America, via the churches adhering to the Orthodox faith. On May 30th, 1892, so it is related, an agreement was drawn up between Alvarez and Villatte, in which the latter acknowledged the confession of faith, the canons and rules of the Syrian Jacobite Church, and rejected all the doctrines which are declared heretical by the said church. He promised that he would be subject and obedient to the Patriarch and to his successors in the Apostolic See of Antioch. In return for this, he would receive from the Antiochene Patriarchate the necessary supply of muran, holy oil, which the Patriarch alone is allowed to consecrate. Villatte also promised to remit to Antioch the annual collection of Peter's pence. Finally, he acknowledged that if he ever severed himself from communion with the Monophysite churches of the Antiochene Rite, or deviated from their canons and rules, he would be subject to dismissal from the dignity of Metropolitan. Mar Julius is said to have presented Mar Timotheus with a certificate of consecration, dated June 5, 1892, which conferred upon him the title of Archbishop of the Old Catholic Church of America, together with the power to consecrate churches, chancels, cemeteries, etc., and to perform all functions appertaining to metropolitan rank. The witnesses to this document were alleged to have been the USA consul for Ceylon and Dr. Lisboa Pinto. It has been suggested that Alvarez and Villatte composed between them the wording of the bull and sent it to the Venerable Patriarch, being fairly certain that he would sign it without asking any awkward questions about the antecedents of a priest in North America who had been ordained by an old Catholic bishop in Switzerland and who had tried unsuccessfully to be raised to the Old Catholic Episcopate. On the other hand, we have to remember that it was this same Peter the Humble who, when Bishop of Emesa, Homs, consecrated the former French Dominican Julius Ferret, and so it is said sent him to Western Europe as patriarchal legate. The two stories are consistent. The second is a sequel to the first. The newly consecrated Old Catholic Archbishop of North America felt it would be worthwhile to break the return journey to the United States and Holland, where, so he related in after years, he was received by the Old Catholic clergy and stayed with the parish priest at Delft. There is also the tale that this priest and Bishop Dipendal of Deventer gave him the money for his first crozier, which was bought at Antwerp before sailing. We are told Villatte used his alma mater, the College of Saint Laurent at Montreal, where he tried to impress the Holy Cross Fathers and the students by displaying his ring and pectoral cross. Having reached Green Bay, he found awaiting him notice of the threatened deposition which had been pronounced by Bishop Grafton in his Cathedral Church of St. Paul, Fond du Lac, on March 21, 1891. This stated, in virtue of the authority left by our Lord Jesus Christ to his church of binding and of loosing, and of putting away every brother that walketh disorderly, we do hereby deprive the said René Villatte of all privileges and powers of the ministry of the church, and depose him from his office as priest. And we call upon all the faithful to keep themselves from any ministrations at his hands. And we do erase and blot out his name from the register of the clergy of this church, in token that if he repent not and amend, God will blot out his name from the book of life. The Old Catholic Catholic Archbishop of North America also found awaiting his return to Wisconsin a report issued by the House of Bishops at the General Convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church, presided over by Dr. Doane, Bishop of Albany, which read, "It appears that the bishops from whom M. Vallot claims to have received consecration belong to a body which is separated from Catholic Christendom because of its non-acceptance of the dogmatic decrees of the Council of Chalcedon as to our Blessed Lord's person. These bishops had no jurisdiction or right to ordain a bishop for any part of the diocese under the charge of the Bishop of Fond du Lac. M. Vallot was never elected by any duly accredited synod. It appears that M. Vallot, in seeking the episcopate, made statements not warranted by the facts of the case, and seemed willing to join with any body, Old Catholic, Greek, Roman, or Syrian, which would confer it upon him. More than 2 months before the time of his so-called consecration, he was deposed from the sacred ministry. In view of these facts, we propose the following resolutions. Resolved, that in the opinion of this House, the whole proceedings in connection with the so-called consecration of J. René Vallot were null and void, and that this Church does not recognize that any episcopal character was thereby conferred. Resolved, that a statement of the above-mentioned facts be sent to the Archbishop of Utrecht, to the Old Catholics of Germany and Switzerland, and to the metropolitans and primates of the Anglican Communion. There is a story that when the Archbishop of North America visited the College of Saint Laurent on his arrival in Canada from Ceylon, he remarked with a smile, "Life is but a farce." After all, what right had these prelates, whose first bishop was consecrated in 1784 by bishops of the Episcopal Church in Scotland, to pass judgment on an archbishop whose consecration had taken place with the express permission of the 126th successor of St. Peter as first Patriarch of Antioch? By way of defiance, one of the first things Vallot did was to raise the wooden chapel of Saint Louis at Green Bay to the status of a pro-cathedral. He had 2 other little chapels under his jurisdiction, St. Joseph's, Walhain, and St. Mary's, Duval. It is recalled that he used to wear a Roman purple cassock in the streets, so as to make people realize that he was an archbishop. He started to publish a short-lived little monthly magazine, The Old Catholic, but it does not seem to have resulted in many converts. To counteract proselytism, Monsignor Mesmer, who had succeeded Monsignor Katzer as Catholic Bishop of Green Bay, on the latter's translation to the Archiepiscopal See of Milwaukee on January 30th, 1891, asked the Premonstratensian canons if they could spare a few Flemish and French-speaking priests to work among the Belgians. One priest, Father Pennings, and a lay brother from Holland came at once, and more sons of St. Norbert followed them across the Atlantic. The former became some years later the first Premonstratensian abbot in the USA. At no time did Vallot ever have a large following in Wisconsin. He claimed that they numbered between 6,000 and 8,000, but even 500 would seem to have been an exaggerated statement. In a grandiose and pretentious way, he simply included all the Belgian settlers whom he hoped to win over to Old Catholicism, and even multiplied their numbers. He had to do this in order to make a big show in the eastern states, where he canvassed among rich Episcopalians, trying unsuccessfully to raise money to build churches which could never be built, or to get clothes for free distribution among the poor. It was only among the small rabid element that he found followers. There were many staunch Catholics who refused to have anything to do with him, even when offered presents and free religious services. In some places, the Archbishop of North America was driven away by the Belgians, but whenever he heard of dissatisfaction about church regulations and so on, he was sure to turn up, organizing meetings, urging the people to throw off the yoke of Rome. In spite of all this propaganda, Vallot did not even manage to make ends meet, and he was obliged to flee from one place to another to avoid creditors who were on his track. He was not invited to say prayers at the solemn opening of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago on May 1st, 1893, as was Monsignor Ireland, Roman Catholic Archbishop of St. Paul. Neither did he take an official part in the World's Parliament of Religions, which was a sideshow at this mammoth affair. Finding himself at the end of his tether less than 2 years after being consecrated, Villatte decided that the best thing he could do was to be reconciled with the Roman Church. On March 26, 1894, Archbishop Satolli, the first apostolic delegate to the USA, informed Monsignor Mesmer that Villatte wished to submit to the Holy See. About 3 weeks later, Villatte wrote to the Bishop of Green Bay that he was already preparing his people for reconciliation with Rome. Further correspondence took place between Satolli, Mesmer, and Villatte. All looked hopeful, but behind the scenes the Archbishop of North America was watching which way the wind was blowing, not wishing to commit himself, before he was sure it would pay him to become once again a slave of the Vatican. He could not decide whether to trust his luck to the Pope or to the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, but in August 1894, matters had got as far as the apostolic delegate advising Bishop Mesmer to finance Villatte's journey to Rome. Because he could not afford the cost himself, no doubt propaganda would refund the money, but the Roman authorities appeared to be in no hurry, and merely inquired about Villatte's manner of ordaining priests, and other details of no immediate importance. Matters dragged on like this for nearly 4 years. In February 1898, the apostolic delegate wrote to the Bishop of Green Bay that Villatte was now quite ready to recant his errors and submit to Holy Mother Church as a layman. These two prelates, however, did not fully fathom the man that they were dealing with. In the interval, Villatte had published a prayer book and catechism for his old Catholics. He had also announced the foundation of a sort of religious order, the Knights of the Crown of Thorns, which would have a monastery at Green Bay as soon as he could find the money to build it. In spite of the offer of a journey to Rome, at the expense of either the Diocese of Green Bay or the Congregation of Propaganda, Villatte continued to waver. Eventually, Monsignor Mesmer realized that there was no hope of a sincere conversion and wrote to Monsignor Satolli. For the present, he has an asylum among the schismatic Poles, who will pay him court until he will be infatuated and foolish enough to consecrate one of them for the episcopate. Then they will cast him out, and being in such an extremity, he will probably have one more recourse to the Catholic Church, asking for money and pardon. But will it be sincere? This is exactly what happened, but not until about 6 years later, and even then the terms offered by Rome did not satisfy Villatte. After the old Catholic Archbishop of North America left Wisconsin, some of his former followers joined a Spiritist movement. A few returned to communion with the Holy See, and the rest submitted to the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Fond du Lac and ended their days as Episcopalians. As to his priest, Father Gautier appears to have been good and sincere, but his successor named Moti is said to have been a scamp and a drunkard who married a girl and subsequently divorced her and ended up as a theosophist. Then came a priest who called himself Lopez or Lopes. Having failed to report himself as a doctor and a conjurer, he moved east and took charge of a schismatic Italian congregation. Lopes is said to have been the last priest of the Villatte Old Catholic movement in and around Green Bay. Today it is almost forgotten, except among very old people. Having failed to show to many Belgians the way out of the slavery of Rome, and apparently utterly indifferent to his obligations toward the Syro-Jacobite Patriarchate, Villatte turned his attention to a much larger body of people, optimistic of gaining support for them. These were the now widely spread Polish Catholics. There had been a fairly steady immigration of Poles into the USA since about 1830, and the first Polish priest arrived in 1851. More and more Poles crossed the Atlantic in the hope of making their fortunes in the New World after the War of 1863. A large number moved on to the Middle West, having heard that there was plenty of work to be had in Chicago and other big cities. After 1873 began a series of difficulties between the Polish priests and the American Catholic bishops. So fused were religion and nationalism with the Poles that most of them were determined not to be integrated with other Catholics. They wanted a church of their own, and to the extremists, communion with Rome was almost a matter of indifference. Towards the close of the century, schismatic Polish congregations existed in Baltimore, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Toledo, and elsewhere. The chief leader of the schismatics was Antoni Kozlowski, who procured episcopal consecration separation from the Dutch Old Catholics on November 17, 1897. It appears that Vilat's first direct service to the disgruntled Poles was in 1894, when a certain Father Kolasiewski invited him to dedicate a church at Cleveland. Shortly after Kozlowski's consecration, Vilat was approached by Stephen Kaminsky, pastor of the Church of the Holy Mother of the Rosary, Buffalo, New York. This priest had failed to persuade the old Catholic Archbishop of Utrecht to raise him to the episcopate. There is a story that he offered Vilat $2,500 cash and $2,500 in notes to be secured by mortgage on church property if he would make him a bishop. Notices were sent out stating that both Cardinal Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore, and Archbishop Martinelli, the apostolic delegate, would assist at the ceremony. It is hardly necessary to add that neither of these prelates put in an appearance. With characteristic bravado, Vilat arrived in Buffalo, and on March 21, 1898, consecrated Kaminsky in his own church, giving him the title of assistant bishop. Kaminsky, alas, had no opportunity to make himself useful to his consecrator. With creditors on his track, he fled to Canada and thence to Europe. He was excommunicated by the Holy See and abandoned by Vilat. The latter felt it safer to lie low until the storm had blown over, and he decided to have no more dealings with the Poles for the time being. His escapade in Buffalo had attracted too much undesirable publicity. But it would have been unlike Vilat not to have found another opening for his talents as an ecclesiastical adventurer, and he did so quickly. During the years 1890 through 1891, when he had been trying to find a bishop to consecrate him, he had heard of and possibly met Father Ignatius of Jesus, Order of St. Benedict, who is recuperating in North America, preaching and giving missions to raise money for his monastery at Llanthony in the Black Mountains of South Wales. During his tour, he had been publicized as the evangelist monk of the British Church, or the Druid of the Welsh Church, and he had informed press reporters that he belonged to an elusive ancient British church, which was the oldest in the world after Antioch and Jerusalem. The reason why Vilat felt it might be to his advantage to link up with Father Ignatius remains uncertain, but here is the most probable explanation. Having heard of Ignatius's obsession with the heresies of Father Fremantle, the Dean of Ripon, and other Anglican clerics in high places, he was prepared to gamble on this eccentric monk supporting him in setting up an old Catholic church in Britain, of which he would become the primate and metropolitan. It has also been suggested that Vilat had been told that Ignatius was wealthy and his abbey richly endowed, also that this missionary monk seldom failed to rake in money by his eloquent preaching. The first step to laying his hands on the money would be to get Ignatius under his influence by raising him to the priesthood. After this, the rest would be easy. As Mr. Arthur Calder Marshall points out, with an opportunist psychopath such as Vilat was, there is nothing inconsistent between these two possibly complementary courses of action. We do not know when Vilat sailed for England, but he turned up in London within 3 months of his consecration of Kaminsky at Buffalo. He laid his plans carefully and managed to persuade Dr. F. G. Lee, the OCR Bishop of Dorchester, upon whom he called to give him a letter of introduction to Ignatius. Not satisfied with this, he dispatched a telegram signed Martimotheos, announcing that he would visit Llanthony within a few days. Unfortunately, the abbot, who had taken the title of Dewi Hundu, David of the Hundu, when he was initiated into the Gorset of the Bards of Wales by the Archdruid Clydford in 1889, was away at the National Eisteddfod. His handful of monks had no idea who was the sender of the telegram until they read Dr. Lee's letter, vouching for the claims of this prelate and hinting that it might be to their advantage to entertain him. No bishop, far less an archbishop, had ever deigned to stay at Llanthony since the monastery was founded in 1870, so one can picture the excitement. Martimotheos arrived in the Black Mountains on July 18th, and Dewi Hundu, Father Ignatius, was now back to welcome him. He had brought not only his archiepiscopal regalia, but also what is described as most interesting Syriac documents with their authorized English translations, with the seals and signatures of the ecclesiastical and civil authorities concerned. His Grace explained that he was in a hurry on his way to Russia at the special invitation of the Holy Synod of Moscow, but if the Reverend Father or any of his monks would care to avail themselves of this unique opportunity to receive absolutely valid holy orders, he would be delighted to supply them there and then. The rest of the story is best told in the words of Father Ilton Mary of the Epiphany Monk Order of St. Benedict as he signed his name to a newspaper article. After the old Catholic Archbishop's arrival at Lanthenay, there went up to God a ceaseless stream of prayer from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m., besides the midnight services daily, that God's will might be done at the present crisis in our history, that our Lord Jesus might be glorified. The Archbishop daily pleaded the Eucharistic memorial for the illumination of the Divine Paraclete. Our Superior presented 3 objections to the Archbishop. First, he could not follow the old Catholics in their excessive rancor against the Church of Rome. The Church of Rome was a bulwark of orthodoxy and Bible defense, and contained countless saints of God. Second, he could never be other than a faithful son to the Church of Britain, and must use the filioque until the national church permitted its erasure from the creed. Third, was not the Syrian church and his church Monophysite? Mar Timotheus managed to convince Father Ignatius that he need not worry about such trivial details, and Father Ilton continues, "We were satisfied. The ordinations were arranged to commence the next day. A monk who has been in our monastery for some years, apparently Dom Ilton Mary himself, and is noted for his gravity, piety, and holiness of life, was to receive the 5 minor orders the following day, Monday, July 25th. On Tuesday he was to be ordained deacon. The Reverend Father's diaconate from the English Church being fully acknowledged, he and the other monk would receive the priesthood on the Wednesday. The Latin rite was used. To use it did not seem half so satisfactory as our own prayer book rite. The word priest was not even used, and at the laying on of hands not a word was said. However, the validity of the rite is questioned by none, though that of the English ordinal is, and we are of course satisfied. We may question whether in future we in the monastery may choose the rite as well as choose the bishop. We were too grateful to our dear Archbishop, however, to question or choose anything, for he won all our hearts by his humility and gentle courtesy. Villatte was kept busy during those last 3 days at Lanthenay. He also confirmed a boy, lately converted by the grace of God. He consecrated veils for the nuns, gave everyone separately his solemn benediction, and consecrated the holy oils. But this was not enough to pay for the generous hospitality. His Grace had failed to persuade Bertie Cannell, the ex-brother Gildas, who had returned to the monastery for a holiday, to accept all minor and major orders up to the priesthood. This unfrocked monk saw much of the Archbishop, because both found smoking necessary, and Father Ignatius held the opinion that God would have provided man with a chimney if he had intended him to smoke tobacco. So Mar Timotheus and young Cannell had to creep out on the mountainside, and on one of these walks the former turned to his companion and said, "I make Father Ignatius a priest tomorrow, and I make you a priest too." Baron Rudolf de Bertuch, the son of Ignatius's first biographer, who met Villatte, and who at that date was a somewhat worldly-minded Roman Catholic 16-year-old youth, whose only attraction to the monks was that they provided him with shooting and fishing, recalls that he was also urged to accept the priesthood. Before leaving Lanthenay, Mar Timotheus blessed Ignatius as abbot, according to the Pontificate Romanum. It was hinted afterwards that he was paid for his services to the community, but as Mr. Calder Marshall remarks, such an idea, in the terms of crude bribe, is unthinkable, but it is profitable that out of the love of Jesus Christ, Father Ignatius pressed on Lord Timotheus some of the abbey funds to defray his expenses. The amount cannot have been very much. In a few weeks, Villatte, who according to Bishop Grafton was a drunkard, and so had more than normally heavy expenses, was broke. All that was gained by these highly irregular ordinations was that Abbot Ignatius and his monks became schismatics in the eyes of Anglo-Catholics, instead of holy eccentrics who deserved pity and even admiration. Lanthenay cut itself off from all relations with what the Reverend Father, both a British Israelite and a firm believer in the so-called flat earth theory, used to refer to as our dear old church, and her apostate bishops. News of these ordinations in South Wales reached the ears of Bishop Grafton in Wisconsin. He felt obliged to write a very long letter to the Church Times, which was printed in part with the comment, "The whole is very melancholy reading, and we can well understand that nothing but a stern sense of duty would have induced the Bishop of Fond du Lac to write in such uncompromising terms." Among other statements was made the following: "I was obliged in the year 1892 to degrade René Villot from the priesthood and excommunicate him from the church. I have discovered that he was morally rotten, a swindling adventurer belonging to the same criminal class as your noted Tichborne claimant. He was reported to me for drunkenness, swindling, obtaining money under false pretenses, and other crimes, and a notorious liar. The man has somewhat exceptional gifts as an impostor. He has the power of endurance of a Catiline, the audacity of a Jeremy Diddler, and the morals of a Tichborne. He can preach and pray with great fervor, and is wont, when discovered, to say with French loftiness that he forgives all his enemies. He has been surrounded by, and had for his tools, a small body of men, mostly ex-Romans, whose equals in crime and debauchery are rarely found. His late secretary is now in a state prison. Another, who called himself amongst his many noms de plume Brother William, and from whose writings most of the material in the articles of your Lanthony correspondent was derived, is now the inmate of an insane asylum, brought there by brutish and sottish drunkenness. Another co-worker, whom he ordained priest under the title of Father Basil, is a renegade from England, having formerly been connected with the Reformed Episcopal Church, and who fled to America, being accused, as his bishop wrote me, of criminal conduct with boys. His name is George Reeder, and the authorities of Scotland Yard wrote concerning him that, while they did not give information to private parties, they would do so to the chief of the police in any of our cities. Of another of his chief advisers, who has now given up the practical exercise of his ministry, I have written proof that he is an adulterer. I know of no clergyman or layman in my diocese who has any other opinion of Villot, but that his proper place is in the penitentiary. He belongs to the low class of criminal governed by inordinate ambition and insatiate greed for money and power. He has no religious principles, as is seen from the course of his life." Bishop Grafton then went on to give a detailed summary of Villot's career, including all his early migrations from one religious denomination to another, mentioning nearly 20 Roman Catholic communities in which he had been a postulant or novice. The effect of this article on readers of the Church Times was to make them feel that poor old Father Ignatius had been fooled by this unscrupulous Franco-American prelate, but he was far from being the first person who had been captivated by what Father Ilton Mary calls our dear Archbishop's humility and gentle courtesy. Many hearts had been won and lost by the way in which Mar Timotheus could, on occasion, preach and pray with great fervor. But long before Bishop Grafton had exposed him, he had left England for the continent. It is improbable that he ever got as far as Russia, which he stated was his destination when he disappeared from South Wales in the last week of July 1898. The next country in which he appeared was Italy. By the end of January 1899, most Catholic newspapers in Europe and North America had reported that Villot was seeking reconciliation with the Holy See of Rome, instead of union with the Holy Synod of Moscow. On February 2nd, Father David Fleming, Definitor General of the Friars Minor and Consultor of the Congregation of the Holy Office, issued a statement to the effect that Joseph René Villot had expressed his most sincere and heartfelt regret for having taught many errors and for having attacked and misrepresented the Holy Roman Catholic Church, that he withdrew any such teaching and regretted that he had obtained holy orders in an unlawful and irregular way, and that he had illicitly and sacrilegiously conferred upon others various orders. This penitent cleric called upon all those with whom he had cooperated in the past, especially those whom he had raised to the priesthood, to submit themselves unreservedly and unconditionally to the authority of the Vicar of Christ. On May 25th, Bishop Zardetti wrote to Monsignor Mesmer that Father David Fleming had the case well in hand. Then came reports from Rome that Villot had not yet made his formal abjuration or been reconciled with the Church. It was explained that he was awaiting the result of the process before the Holy Office. As soon as a decision had been reached about the validity of his orders, he would be received back into communion with the Holy See. Meanwhile, the Holy Office had received an 8-page digest from the Bishop of Green Bay, in which he laid stress on Vilat's insincerity in the past, suggesting that he merely wanted the Roman authorities to say that his orders were valid, so that he might go to England and validate the orders of Anglican clergymen. Monsignor Mesmer disclosed that Vilat had admitted to him personally that he had never been in good faith. Monsignor Katzer, now Archbishop of Milwaukee, with whom Vilat had been in contact many years before, also advised the Holy Office to delay passing judgment on his orders in order to test his sincerity. It is not known how long the irregularly consecrated but apparently penitent archbishop remained in Rome, presumably at the expense of the ecclesiastical authorities. But early in 1900, it was reported that he was in France. His hosts were the Benedictine monks of the Abbey of Saint Martin de Ligouge, near Poitiers. He appeared to have told them that he wanted to make a careful study of ordinations in the Syro-Malabar Church, so that he could convince the Holy Office of the validity of his episcopate. One day, Joris Karl Huysmans, the French novelist who had been converted to a living Christian faith by a visit to the Trappist monastery of Igny, paid a visit to Ligouge. He was accompanied by a young friend of the prior, Dom Chamard, by name Abbot de la Haute Chambre. They encountered Vilat at dinner in the refectory. Abbot recalled in years after that he was a clean-shaven, coarse-skinned giant of Herculean stature, who looked like an American athlete, and whose thighs were encased in pale green trousers. Great was the astonishment of these two guests when one of the monks confided that this apparition was none other than Monsignor Vilat, the old Catholic Archbishop of Babylon. After tracing Vilat's subsequent relations with the Catholic Church, Abbot concluded briefly, but charitably, "He is dead now. May he rest in peace, for his Havanas were excellent." But the old Catholic Archbishop of Babylon was not merely enjoying the hospitality of the Benedictines, browsing in their library, and smoking cigars. He had been up to mischief as usual. On April 17, 1900, Cardinal Richard, Archbishop of Paris, circulated a warning among his clergy to be on their guard against priests who produced celebrants signed by Vilat. On June 13th that same year, the Roman authorities issued a decree of major excommunication against two priests, Paolo Miraglia Gulotti and Joseph René Vilat. On May 6th, the latter had consecrated the former as Old Catholic Bishop for Italy, with the title of Bishop of Piacenza. Thus came into being the Italian National Episcopal Church. Bishop Gulotti soon found that the majority of Italians were quite content to be members of an international church. By May 1908, he was over in North America working with Vilat. Having gained nothing but wandering for 2 years around Europe, except presumably free board and lodging, Mar Timotheus decided to seek refuge in Canada, as he had done on several previous occasions. Early in 1901, he retired to St. Joseph's Island, at the north end of Lake Huron, and this remained his headquarters for the next 2 years. Some of the half-breed Indians on the island were so overawed by his Roman purple cassock and archiepiscopal insignia that he displayed on every possible occasion that they started to attend his chapel. This displeased the local Jesuit priest, whom Vilat denounced more than once for disrespect towards a prelate. The old Catholic Archbishop of North America, as he still called himself, must often have been very bored and lonely on his island in Ontario. Yet though he was right at the back of beyond, he still kept a close watch on international affairs, ecclesiastical as well as political. It looks as if he still had hopes of persuading Father Ignatius of Lanthony to become the first archbishop of an autocephalous old Catholic British Church, and letting him perform the consecration. This project had been in the air since November 1898. Ignatius wrote to an archbishop, apparently Alvarez in Ceylon, on October 9, 1900, suggesting that the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch might allow the consecration of a bishop for Lanthony Abbey, and thus preserve for us the true priesthood for all time to come. He feared that before long it would be impossible for any Catholic Christians to remain in communion with the British Church, but it is not certain just how far Vilat was mixed up with this project. Nevertheless, apparently regarding the whole world as his province, and possibly to defy Mar Jacobus, Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex, Vernon Hereford, who since his consecration in South India in December 1902 had been able to supply Syro-Chaldean Nestorian orders at Oxford. Mar Timotheus turned up again in South Wales in the summer of 1903. On June 14th, he raised to the episcopate the Reverend Henry M. Marsh Edwards with the title of Bishop of Caerleon. The Syrian Malabar line of succession was handed on in a room over at a shop at Barry Dock. This ex-Anglican clergyman had been deprived of his living in the Diocese of Southwell on charges of immorality. The following morning, the old Catholic Archbishop of North America, assisted by the Archbishop of Caerleon, consecrated a young man named Henry Bernard Vertham, on whom he seems to have already conferred priest's orders. Ventham assumed the title of Bishop of Dorchester. It is probable that more priests were ordained that summer, both in England and on the continent, but documentary proof is lacking. It is hard to know how far Villatte was ever sincere in what he did and what he said. For instance, what was at the back of his mind on June 20th, 1905, when he wrote to the Jacobite Metropolitan of Malabar, telling him of ceaseless persecution he had to endure from both Episcopalians and Roman Catholics in America, yet boasting that he had managed to pervert at least 500,000 papists. He added, "I very sorrowfully confess that I had returned to the abominable heresy of Rome 6 years ago. It did not take me more than 6 months to see the abomination and desolation of that schismatical and heretical Roman Church. I immediately took my stand before God, rose, and worked against the lie of Rome in favor of our Holy Orthodox faith." A series of conflicts between the Church and State in France, arising from the anti-clerical legislation of Waldeck-Rousseau and Combes, gave Villatte the idea that it might be to his advantage to return to his native country. This he did in the summer of 1906. The previous December, a separation bill had become law, proclaiming that the Republic did not recognize any form of religion. It appears that Villatte was already on friendly terms with Aristide Briand, who had been appointed Minister of Education in 1903, and probably thought that this astute politician would be able to make use of his services. There were rumors of the setting up of a national church on Gallican lines. The state now had the power to sequester property administered by church councils and pass it over to welfare and charitable institutions under the control of local authorities. Villatte, soon after his arrival in Paris, took advantage of this new law and managed to obtain possession of the Barnabite church in the Rue Legendre, which he reopened for Old Catholic services. He contributed articles to a review of Gallican tendencies called L'Église catholique francaise. One of his former priests in Wisconsin, a certain Florent, who had also returned to France, wrote for Le Livre Parole. Debts accumulated, however, and on March 2, 1907, the police in Paris took away the archiepiscopal mitres and crozier for default in payment. It looks as if Villatte managed to retrieve his regalia before June 21st, when he ordained priest Louis-Marie François Giraud, formerly a Trappist monk of Fontcambald, but who had since made a name for himself as a magician, and who was associated with the prelates and priests of the Universal Gnostic Church. Shortly after this, a notice was issued by Cardinal Richard warning the faithful against apostate priests who were celebrating Mass under cover of a religious association directed by a pseudo-American bishop. The cardinal stated that this plot, hatched in the silence characteristic of Masonry, will not succeed. Catholics will not let themselves be deceived. Clemenceau and Briand may rob us of our churches, but not of our consciences. Villatte was then excommunicated by the Archbishop of Paris for a second time. Realizing perhaps that his national church was a failure, Mar Timotheus tried to join the Romanian Orthodox Church as a simple priest, but its clergy in Paris were not interested in him. The only result of all this plotting and scheming was to launch a schismatic and heretical church sect, which in the past half-century has split up into several tiny splinter churches with impressive titles. In the end, having seen that there was no chance of earning a living by his wits in France, and having bungled everything as badly as he had done with the Belgians and Poles in the United States, he again crossed the Atlantic. Chicago became the headquarters of the now freelance archbishop, who by this time had severed all associations with the independent Catholic bishop of Goa and Ceylon, the Syro-Jacobite patriarch of Antioch, as well as with the old Catholic churches in Europe. The consecration of Francis Hodder at Utrecht by 3 Dutch Old Catholic bishops on September 29, 1907, followed by the organization of the Polish National Catholic Church in America, had been the final blow to his hopes of using these schismatics from the Roman Church for his own ends. He moved around the country and more than once found reasons to cross the border into Canada. It appears to have been at Winnipeg in 1909 that he ordained 2 monks from Lanthony Abbey, Dom Asaph Harris and Dom Gildas Taylor. The former returned to his Welsh monastery as superior. The latter went to Mexico, where for some years he worked with schismatic clergy who were being sponsored by Vilat as the nucleus of a national church. It was at Chicago a year or 2 after this that Mar Timotheus raised to the priesthood Dom Francis Brothers, prior of St. Dunstan's Abbey, Waukegan, Illinois. It was an old Catholic fraternity, legally incorporated at Fond du Lac in 1909 by Bishop Grafton as the American Congregation of the Order of St. Benedict, and of which he acted as titular abbot until his death in 1912. But Mar Timotheus and the future metropolitan of the so-called Old Catholic Church in America soon parted company, and in May 1915 the former was protesting against the activities of an Italian ex-Roman priest who is masquerading as one of our bishops. This was probably Miraglia Gilotti, who, having had no luck as bishop of Piacenza, had migrated to New York. Or it may have been Carfora, who seems to have been associated with Vilat in France. Vilat probably realized that it was useless trying his luck again in Europe, since most of the countries where he might have found friends and benefactors had been at war since August 1914. The only thing he could do was to devise some organization in the United States, of which he would be the head. By 1915, the former Old Catholic Archbishop of North America had launched a new schismatic body, which he called the American Catholic Church. During that same year, he received a distinguished convert into this organization, whose grandiose title could only have deceived the very simple-minded. This was the Reverend Frederick Ebenezer Lloyd, whose career had been almost as adventurous as his own. Ordained priest of the Church of England by Dr. Macarnus, Bishop of Oxford, for some years he worked as a missionary in Newfoundland, but his record there was not altogether satisfactory. For more reasons than one, Mr. Lloyd felt it better to move to the United States, where he was elected before long to a bishopric in the Protestant Episcopal Church. Investigations were made into his antecedents, with the result that he was degraded from the Anglican priesthood on January 16, 1907. The House of Bishops washed their hands of this clergyman, so he went over to Rome. There, where, however, no prospects of the priesthood, because he had been twice married. After 2 years in communion with the Holy See as a layman, he returned to the Episcopalian fold, and was allowed to resume his ministerial functions. But as there was little chance of preferment, it is easy to understand why he found convincing reasons to join the newly founded American Catholic Church. Not only was Lloyd a man of great charm, endowed with good looks, but he had ample private means, thanks to his second wife. It is not surprising, therefore, that Vilat welcomed Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd with open arms. A fortnight after Monsignor Mundelein, auxiliary bishop of Brooklyn, had been translated to the Archiepiscopal See of Chicago, another ceremony took place in this same city, reported as follows in the American Catholic Quarterly. By far the most important event in the ecclesiastical history of the United States of America was celebrated on Wednesday, December 19, 1915, when the Reverend Frederick E. J. Lloyd, Doctor of Divinity, was consecrated as first bishop of the American Catholic Church in St. David's Chapel, 536 East 36th Street, Chicago, Illinois. A day of rare though wintry loveliness added to the interest of the occasion. The consecration service began at 10:30 and continued about the space of 2 hours. The chapel was filled with worshippers who were largely personal friends of Dr. Lloyd. The entire pontifical service was celebrated according to the Latin Rite, though of course in English. The consecrator was the Most Reverend Archbishop Joseph René Villatte, primate and metropolitan, and the assisting bishop, the Right Reverend Paul Miraglia Galati of New York. At the conclusion of this long function, Mar Timotheos addressed the newly consecrated prelates, saying, "It needs no prophet to foretell for you and the American Catholic Church a great future in the providence of God. The need for a church both American and Catholic, and free from paparchy and all foreign denomination, has been felt for many years by Christians of all the denominations. May your zeal and apostolic ministry be crowned with success." By the time that the USA had joined forces with the Allies in April 1917, Villatte had already begun to fade out of the picture. He had reached the age of 61 in 1914, and his dynamic energy was already diminishing. At a synod held in Chicago on April 10, 1920, 3 months after the peace treaty had been ratified in Paris, he offered to retire and nominated Lloyd as his successor as primate and metropolitan of the American Catholic Church. The clergy present granted Villatte the honorary title of exarch. He lived in retirement at 427 North Mulligan Avenue, Chicago, and does not seem to have performed any more episcopal functions until September 22, 1921, when he helped to launch the African Orthodox Church by consecrating in the Church of Our Lady of Good Death, Chicago, a Negro from Antigua, George Alexander McGuire, as the first bishop of yet another new sect. It may be assumed that the funds at the disposal of the American Catholic Church, even with a generous donation from Mrs. Lloyd, were not sufficient to allow the exarch an adequate old age pension. Not long after his consecration of McGuire, Villatte decided to return to his native France. It is possible that he hoped that Monsignor Giraud, the faith healer and occultist, now known as Archbishop of Elmira and Patriarch of the Église Catholique Francaise, or Monsignor Bricaud, alias Tao Jean II, or Johnny Bricaud, the Gnostic writer on black and white magic, would befriend him as the virtual founder of their sects. We cannot say what were his motives, but on June 1, 1925, Mar Timotheos made a formal declaration before Monsignor Ceretti, Apostolic Nuncio, at Paris, regretting and repenting having received holy orders and having conferred them on others, contrary to the teaching and laws of the Holy Roman Church, in which he hoped, by the grace of God, soon to be received. He asked pardon of God for the scandal he had given and promised to repair it by the example of his life, inviting all those who had followed his errors to imitate his example. A week later, LaCroix and other newspapers announced that Monsignor Villatte, with an American boy servant, was staying with the Cistercian monks of the Common Observance at the Abbey of Pont Colbert near Versailles. There were rumors that it was at the request of Pius XI that the prior had offered the ex-archbishop of the American Catholic Church an eventide home. Another bit of gossip was that the Pope had granted him a pension of 22,000 francs annually in recognition of his episcopal status. On June 23, 1925, the Bayerischer Kurier published a statement at the orders of the Swiss Christian Catholic Church to the effect that Villatte had never been a priest of this body or of any other genuine old Catholic Church. Monsignor Ceretti felt it worthwhile to reply to this newspaper as follows. Monsignor Villatte received the minor orders and the order of subdeacon on June 5, 1885, the order of deacon on June 6 of the same year, and on the following day, i.e. June 7, 1885, the ordination to the priesthood. All these orders were conferred on him by Monsignor Herzog, Old Catholic Bishop, in the Old Catholic Church at Bern. This is proved by documents bearing the seal and signature of Monsignor Herzog. Concerning his episcopal consecration, it took place on May 29, 1892. Monsignor Villatte was consecrated by 3 Jacobite bishops in the Cathedral of Archbishop Alvarez, Julius I, i.e. in the Church of Our Lady of Good Death in Colombo, Ceylon. Monsignor Villatte is likewise in possession of the consecration deed in question, bearing the signatures of the three above-mentioned bishops and of the American consul who was present at the ceremony. So much for explanation, should you deem it appropriate for your use. This letter from the Apostolic Nuncio at Paris was printed in the Bayerischer Courier on July 11th, 1925. Villatte must have been pleased that he had managed to convince Monsignor Chiaretti of the facts of his priesthood and episcopate, even if both were irregular. For the next 3.5 years, he led a quiet and secluded life in a cottage within the monastery grounds, waited on by his boy servant. Out of politeness, he was addressed as Monsignor, or referred to as Sa Grandeur. His ordinary costume was a soutane, though without any episcopal insignia. Stories went around Paris that Pius XI had been prepared to allow Villatte's reordination to the priesthood sub conditionae, but that he had refused the papal offer, being convinced that he was a bishop as well as a priest. The aged prelate usually attended the daily conventional mass, sitting in a remote corner of the chapel, receiving Holy Communion only on Sundays. No formal pronouncement on the validity of his orders was ever made by the Roman authorities. Growing impatient of being treated as a layman, he managed to procure a chalice and vestments and started to celebrate Mass in his cottage. According to the late Monsignor Chaptal, auxiliary bishop of Paris, he got hold of a mitre and crozier if he had not brought them with him from Chicago, and presumably having consecrated the holy oils, gave minor and major orders up to the priesthood to one of the Cistercian novices. Not satisfied with this escapade, Martimotheus raised him to the episcopate. It appears that the ridiculous affair was kept quiet, but if true, it is surprising that the prior of Pontcolbert did not offer Sa Grandeur to vacate his cottage and clear off the premises there and then. Monsignor Chaptal also relates that Cardinal Mary del Val had already decided that Villatte had so commercialized ordinations and consecrations that he himself did not regard them as valid. The end came suddenly. Martimotheus died of heart failure on July 8, 1929. He was buried not in episcopal vestments in the cemetery at Versailles. One of the bishops he had consecrated and 2 priests he had ordained were among the mourners. A requiem mass was celebrated as for a layman in the monastery chapel. Shortly after the funeral, both his American servant and his private papers vanished. Such was the harlequinade to the pantomime in which this buccaneer ecclesiastical adventurer played the principal boy with a very odd cosmopolitan supporting chorus. If ever there was a bishop at large, it was this son of a Parisian butcher. The trouble was that he was born at least 100 years too late. He was a flashy and Baroque period piece that did not fit into a Gothic revival setting. By the time he appeared on the stage, most religious denominations had become too respectable to be able to make use of his undoubted talents. Had he lived in 17th or 18th century France, he might easily have risen to be a Gallicanizing archbishop or even a cardinal, holding many rich benefices, plotting and scheming on the back stairs of the palaces of the Tuileries in Versailles, and a persona grata, if not with the Bourbon kings, at least with their mistresses. Yet when recalling the kaleidoscopic career of this utterly unstable Frenchman, it is as well to remember that the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was cast into the sea, and enclosed fish of every kind at once. Peter the fisherman did manage to get this very odd fish entangled in the meshes of his net before he died, and that is something for which we can be thankful. Yet at the same time, it is difficult to forget the remark made shortly after his consecration in Ceylon: "Life is but a farce." Was his final conversion really sincere? The answer is not ours to give. Chapter 5. Ulrich Vernon Herford, Mar Jacobus, Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex, administrator of the Metropolitan See of India, Ceylon, Millipur, etc., of the Syro-Chaldean Church, and of the Patriarchate of Babylon in the East, founder of the Evangelical Catholic Communion. Utterly different in character and origins from Joseph René Villatte was another independent bishop, more or less his contemporary, Ulrich Vernon Herford, 1866 to 1938. Most of his wide circle of friends of many religious denominations, or of none, regarded him as an eccentric visionary, but few seem to have questioned his sincerity. He is remembered not only for his in-shout learning and personal charm, but also for his fidelity to his convictions. Born at Manchester of a distinguished Unitarian family, Ulrich's father, W. H. Herford, was a pioneer of modern education. His cousin, Professor C. H. Herford, obtained international fame in the field of English literature. Ulrich, having been educated at Owens College, Manchester, then a constituent college of the university, obtained there the degree of Bachelor of Arts in 1889 and an associateship the following year. From 1889 to 1891, he was a student at Manchester College, Oxford, Unitarian, whence he moved to St. Stephen's House, presumably having become an Anglican, and with Anglican orders in view. About 1892, however, he received a Presbyterian form of ordination and became minister of the Unitarian Chapel at King's Lynn. Then followed another spell at Manchester College, Oxford, and the charge of a Unitarian chapel at Whitechurch, Shropshire. He returned to Oxford in 1897 as minister of a congregation connected with Manchester College, the status of which was Free Protestant. The following year, Herford built a new red-brick chapel in Percy Street, off the Iffley Road, on the eastern side of Magdalen Bridge, not far from the Cowley Fathers Church of St. John the Evangelist. He called it the Church of the Divine Love. The adjacent house became known as the monastery, for it was occupied by a few young men who led a quasi-Franciscan life. He composed a rule for this order of the Christian faith. In February 1900, there appeared the first issue of a monthly paper entitled The Christian Churchman. Herford's dream by this time was a united Christendom, in which, so we are told, the best and most precious elements of East and West, of Catholic and Protestant, should be gathered together in one evangelical Catholic communion. It was to be a long and lonely voyage, lasting to the end of his life, with little outward encouragement and many disappointments, but it can truly be said that he never swerved from his course. Having lived in Oxford on and off for more than 10 years, Herford had acquired a fairly comprehensive knowledge of all aspects of Anglicanism. None of them appeared to offer just what he was seeking by way of a historic church. Neither the austere evangelicalism in a much restored medieval Gothic setting at St. Aldate's, nor the ornate Anglo-Catholicism in the Byzantine-esque Basilica of St. Barnabas, which at that date represented the two extremes, made sufficient appeal. It is easy to understand that he turned aside from what the Jesuits had to offer him in the floridly furnished St. Aloysius's, and it was not until 1921 that Oxford saw the return of the Dominicans, whose spirituality and presentation of Catholic worship might have attracted him more. One day it dawned on him that he must look further east than the Cowley Fathers Church, round the corner from Percy Street, by the autumn of 1901. He was certain that he must make a pilgrimage to Persia, for he was now convinced that the Nestorian Church was the purest and most primitive branch of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Herford was far from being the first English Protestant who had made this discovery. In 1842, Mr. George Badger, chaplain of the East India Company, visited Mesopotamia. 10 years later, he published a 2-volume book entitled The Nestorians and Their Rituals, which was edited by Dr. J. M. Neal. This led to missionaries being sent out to these Protestants of the East who had no crucifixes, images, or pictures of saints in their churches, who abjured the Mother of God and abhorred the Pope. The idea at the time was that the Nestorians must be very much the same as Low Church Anglicans, Catholic in the primitive sense but not Roman. All they needed was spiritual and material assistance from sound Protestants. In 1868, their patriarch Mar Shimun and his clergy appealed to Dr. Tate, Archbishop of Canterbury, to befriend them. But it was not until 1886 that Tate's successor, Dr. Benson, helped to found the so-called Archbishop's mission to the Assyrian Christians on high church lines. It was possible for Hereford to have read all about this purest and most primitive branch of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in Maclean and Brown's The Catholicos of the East and His People, first published in 1892. But for some reason or other, this liberal Christian minister at Oxford did not take the direct and obvious route to his spiritual goal. Instead of getting in touch with the Anglican missionaries, who would have been able to introduce him to the Reverend and honored Father of Fathers and Great Shepherd, the Catholicos and Patriarch of the East, the full title of the ecclesiastical and civil head of the Nestorian Church and People, Hereford wrote to Mar Basilius Soares, Bishop of Trécourt, a town on the Malabar coast of South India, who was the head of a small body whose original members had been Catholics of the Syro-Chaldean Rite, who had defied the authority of the Holy See in the 1860s and lapsed into schism. Mar Basilius called himself Metropolitan of the Syro-Chaldean Church in India, Ceylon, Socotra, and Messina. His flock numbered no more than 8,000, if that, and their associations with the Nestorian Church were less than 40 years old. Hereford throughout his life was basically a simple soul, so kind-hearted that he was an easy victim to beggars, hawkers, and other importune persons. In this case, he must have accepted this South Indian prelate on his nomenclature without investigating his antecedents, since it would have been difficult to lay hands on any information at Oxford. Few people at that date were even aware of the existence of this tiny sect. Mar Basilius, otherwise Luis Mariano Suarez, or Suarez, seems to have been a typical specimen of those South Indian Christians who are never so happy as when excommunicating each other and forming splinter churches. He was a Euro-Indian of Portuguese Brahmin descent. He threw off the yoke of Rome in his youth and was ordained priest by another lapsed Catholic, none other than Julius Alvarez, Metropolitan of the Independent Catholic Church of Goa and Ceylon, the consecrator of Joseph René Vallot. In 1899, Suarez persuaded a certain Mar Antonios ibn Ishu, who since about 1876 had been head of yet another schismatic sect known as the Malusians, to raise him to the episcopate. The Malusians had their center at Tirchur in the northern part of the Travancore Cochin state. Their history is confusing and hard to condense, but briefly it is as follows. The founders were Syro-Malabar priests in communion with Rome, among whom was Anthony Thondanata, who in 1862 managed to receive consecration by the Nestorian Patriarch Simon XVII Abraham, and thereafter styled himself as Mar Antonios Abdishu, Metropolitan of India. It appears that about 3 years later he was reconciled with the Holy See, but fell into schism again about 1876, when he assumed the leadership of the Malusians. He died in 1900 and was succeeded by Mar Basilius, i.e. Suarez. Hereford wrote to this prelate on February 27, 1902, and said, "I should be very glad to be of any service to you in England if we could establish ecclesiastical relations, as I have a small independent monastic church and many friends, and some fellow presbyters who think I would be in sympathy with your church." Mar Basilius replied on March 25th, "I would be extremely pleased to accept your sincere request to establish ecclesiastical relations in amalgamating your pure and progressive work to our church in all extensions." It must be admitted that Hereford's picture of his so-called independent monastic church at Oxford was almost as far removed from the truth as was Vallot's account of his old Catholic church in Wisconsin when he wrote to Alvarez in 1891. But the difference was that Hereford was absolutely sincere, whereas Vallot was probably well aware that he was conveying a false impression to the head of the Independent Catholic Church of Goa and Ceylon. The result was the same. Each schismatic archbishop in the Far East was eager to have his sect brought into ecclesiastical relations with what he supposed must be a wealthy and powerful ally against papal pretensions and the machinations of Rome. So the presbyter in Percy Street, Oxford, wrote back that he would be proud to entertain His Excellency if he could spare the time to come to England to consecrate him and another presbyter. Hereford visualized that the roughly 50 or so members of his congregation and the few members of the Order of the Christian Faith who formed its monastic section would become a sort of English branch under the title of the Evangelical Catholic Church, of what he called the Church Universal. He offered to pay part of the whole of traveling expenses, not only of the metropolitan, but also those of another bishop to be co-consecrator. He reminded Mar Basilius that he would be able to see at least some portions of the coronation pageant of King Edward VII, which takes place in June, adding our churches are all independent, and ours is quite under my power. He hinted to his correspondent that if he raised him to the episcopate, I think we would soon have a strongly organized church, which would help towards uniting all Christians in one. There are 4 of us here, and I hope to have more before long. We have many friends, and some of them are very influential. On May 27th, Mar Basilius wrote that he feared it would involve too great an expense to bring himself and another bishop to England and to entertain them, and suggests that it would be cheaper if he were accompanied merely by his private secretary. Although the coronation festivities of Edward VII greatly tempted him, he regretted that his responsible office prevented any sudden move to a foreign country until before November or December the following year. Hereford replied that the thought had occurred to him that perhaps it would be better for himself and his fellow presbyter to come out to India for their consecration. He asked Mar Basilius if his church had its succession of bishops from the Nestorian Church in Asia Minor, which suggests that he had not troubled to investigate its brief history. The Metropolitan was asked to send a plan of the succession of bishops as far back as convenient, and there had been only 2 bishops since the said church came into existence. This request was easily met with. After the exchange of more letters, Hereford sailed alone in the German liner Barbarossa, bound for Ceylon, leaving England in October 1902. He landed at Colombo on November 15th, and 2 days later crossed the Straits to India. It is to be presumed that this Unitarian minister in irregular Presbyterian orders for 10 years, as he stated, had received Christian baptism, but his biographer does not mention it. Hereford must have been in a frantic hurry to get the jobs done as quickly as possible, because he remained in South India no longer than a fortnight. He was hurried through the ordinations as deacon and priest in 2 days. The ceremonies took place in the Church of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows at Dindigul on November 21st and 23rd. After this, he and Mar Basilius moved to Palithaman in the Madura district, where on St. Andrew's Day, November 30th, this episcopal consecration was carried out in the Church of the Epiphany. Hereford was given the name, title, and style of Mar Jacobus, Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex, including the county of London, with apparently full jurisdiction over Great Britain and Ireland. Judging from the diary kept by Hereford during the 14 days spent in South India, he seems to have been rather surprised to find that these Nestorians were not quite the simple Bible Christians he had been led to believe. He describes their strange, almost barbaric ritual and ceremonial, how gorgeous state umbrellas were held over the heads of himself and his consecrator as they walked in procession round the village. There were curious heart-shaped standards surrounded by small crosses and small scarlet flags, which men bore in front. 7 horns were blown on each side in front, and numerous drums, and exactly the same, so far as I could perceive, notes were played, and cry raised at the heathen funeral procession. In fact, there was a triumphantly joyous din. Petards were fired off several times during the day. He gives details of the as yet unfamiliar vestments which he had to put on before his consecration, and how crowds of men, women, and children came up, knelt, and kissed his ring. After he had been solemnly enthroned as Lord Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex, he ends his long account of these functions with the words, "I felt sorry to leave them, as I had got quite fond of them. Of course they must be in a childish condition, as shown by their tolerance of the Christmas tree, tinsel decoration of the church, but they seem to have many childlike virtues, too. My ring and staff are the present of Mar Basilius. The silver ring is made by the village goldsmith, and the crozier carved out of wood by the village carpenter. Although we have what appears to be Hereford's own account of his ordinations and consecration, there have been and still are certain people bold enough to maintain that he was a complete impostor from start to finish. Their suspicions are due to the fact that the documents he produced in support of his claims are in his own handwriting and sealed with an English rubber stamp. At the bottom are some signatures, with that of Mar Basilius in red ink. It is related that Hereford admitted to the late Sir James Marchant, KBE, that at least part of these documents were written by himself, and that he had signed the name of Mar Basilius in two of them. The probable explanation of this irregularity is that Suarez had little or no education. In fact, Hereford remarked in his diary that Mar Basilius seems very glad to make full use of my small store of theological knowledge. As Father Brandreth points out, this would perhaps also account for the fact that the forms of ordination and consecration mentioned thereon bear striking resemblance to those of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which one would not suppose would be familiar to a Brahmin Nestorian in southern India. In after years, it greatly distressed Hereford that anybody ventured to cast doubts on the validity of his orders. He was very worried in 1909 that the Dutch Old Catholics refused to recognize his letters of consecration. Eventually, he managed to procure a stationary declaration dated November 26, 1919, in which Mr. Stanier Walter, then Mayor of Oxford, vouched for the genuineness of certain documents and papers entrusted to him by the Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex relating to his ordination, consecration, etc. But one cannot help wondering on what grounds the mayor felt able to swear on so technical a matter. Last but not least, the extraordinary thing is that this former Unitarian liberal Christian or Free Protestant minister, who was such a modernist and so heterodox in most of his theological opinions, should have had such a superstitious belief in the magic of apostolic succession. The newly consecrated Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex boarded the SS Guerra at Colombo on December 7, 1902, and landed at Southampton on New Year's Day. Not long after he returned to Oxford, he wrote to his Beatitude Marshamun, Patriarch of Seleucia Sestipon and Catholicos of the East, informing him that he was now a bishop of the Chaldean Patriarchate, and explaining to him, "I believe that our Syro-Chaldean Church is the purest and most primitive branch of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and historically represents the Evangelical Catholic Church, which I believe it is the purpose of Almighty God to make the center of reconciliation and harmony, to unite in one fold under the one shepherd, our Lord Jesus Christ. The sadly sundered parts of Christendom, Eastern and Western, Catholic and Protestant, I offer to you the loyal homage of myself and all the faithful under my jurisdiction in England, and our affectionate expression of reverence and respect. We shall ever consider ourselves in communion with your beatitude, unless you were to compel us to leave that communion, as I am sure that you would never willingly do, by imposing upon us conditions that our consciences and the authority of Holy Scripture would not allow us to bear. I am happy to be able to tell your beatitude that several churches in Ceylon will probably be in communion with your church very soon, and will, by placing themselves under my jurisdiction, in this way join your beatitude's patriarchate. It appears that Mar Basilius, in addition to consecrating Hereford as bishop for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, had granted him an undefined status as British administrator of the Syro-Chaldean Metropolitan See of India, even if the expected influx of a large number of Christians in Ceylon into the Patriarchate of Babylon did not materialize. Nevertheless, Mar Jacobus could not regard himself as taking precedence as a prelate over Dr. Francis Francis Paget, who succeeded Dr. William Stubbs in 1901 for the Bishop of Oxford, could not claim to be in communion with any of the historic Eastern churches, as the Bishop of Mercia and Middlesex believed he was. Having settled down in Oxford again, Hereford took his episcopal obligations very seriously. He started to collect money for the relief of his fellow Nestorians in South India. He bought candlesticks and other church furnishings for them, and arranged for a supply of Bibles to be sent to Mar Basilius from the British and Foreign Bible Society at Madras. We are told that Bishop Hereford's concern for the Indian Christians and for their Assyrian parent church was to be like a thread running through the embroidery of his life. Mar Basilius died during a cholera epidemic in July 1903. In December that same year, Mar Jacobus, now regarding himself as the father and God of this handful of Nestorians in South India, wrote a very long pastoral letter addressed to his beloved fellow workers and the children of the Lord, consoling with them at the loss of their metropolitan and giving them words of encouragement lest they were tempted to return to communion with Rome. He begged them to honor the memory of their deceased archbishop by clinging loyally to our holy evangelical Catholic Church, into which he had gathered them, so that they might find a clearer light from heaven upon their souls and minds, and be freed from the errors and false doctrine which had been taught them by the priests who were under the denomination of the Vatican. Let no faint-heartedness, weakness, or fear tempt you to desert our holy Church, or betray our cause, was his clarion call from Oxford. Do not, like Judas, sell your Lord. Moreover, instead of worshiping God in a language which they could not understand, his beloved children would be glad to know that before long he would be able to give them a new service book in English and Tamil. Not only would it contain the most beautiful parts of the Latin Mass, which it will resemble, and of our ancient Syro-Chaldean and Malabar liturgies, but it would as far as possible contain all the most beautiful parts from all the ancient liturgies of Greece, Egypt, Spain, England, and other parts of the Christian world. The evangelical Catholics of the Nestorian Church in South India would be able to boast that their new service book is more truly Christian and more really Catholic than any other liturgy in the world. Mar Jacobus recommended that images of saints should be removed from the altars of our churches and be placed at the sides of the churches, and felt that it would be better if no figure but that of our Savior be placed on any altar. Mar Jacobus felt that this South Indian flock needed a resident bishop, for he could hardly look after it properly more than 5,000 miles away in Percy Street, Oxford. Had any of his presbyters shown signs of the qualifications for a bishop as laid down by St. Paul in the 3rd chapter of his first epistle to Timothy, no doubt he would have been raised to the episcopate and sent out to Trichur. It was in the autumn of 1904 that Hereford thought he had come across the right man. He had read the story entitled Hadrian VII, whose title page proclaimed the author to be Father Rolf. There were other people who had felt called to write to this unknown cleric, as he appeared to be, expressing admiration for his narrative of a rejected student for the priesthood who was elected pope and finally martyred. Realizing no doubt that much of the earlier part of the book was autobiographical, and feeling sorry for Frederick William Serafino Austin Lewis Mary Rolfe, otherwise known as Baron Corvo, Mar Jacobus decided to make up a generous offer. On receipt of a letter from this bishop in Oxford, Corvo wrote to J.T. Macqui on December 8, 1904, I shall have a rare tale to tell you in my next, for the perusal of Hadrian has induced a certain Syro-Chaldean prelate precipitously to offer me a bishopric of over 25,000 Christians in 20 churches. I fancy the man's a fraud and a schismatic, and that what he wants is an apostate. But we shall see. I'm making a few inquiries. Having made inquiries, Corvo wrote again to this same correspondent a week later. Bishop of Sodom and Gomorrah in partibus is excellent, but how frightful. I thought all those people were ritualists or Jesuits or Wesleyans. Vernon Hereford, it appears, was introduced to H by Richard Whiting of the Yellow Van, a fine talker whom I respect. If V.H. is a friend of his, I shall only tell him of my opinion, and forever after hold my peace. If not, I'll ask Bernard and Taylor, who are conducting my case against the Chartrand Code prose expert, whether it is desirable to send VH's papers to Le Boucher of Truth, you understand that being in shady circumstances myself, I'm not anxious to pop into publicity unnecessarily. Of course, I said from the first that a man who offered me a bishopric must be a fraud. What I felt was that there was 9/10 of a chance of this being a fraud, and 1/10 of his being an ambassador from the divine ones inhabiting Olympian mansions, that's all. The last letter from the author of Hadrian VII, relative to Hereford, quoted in this essay, contains the words, "I've written to VH asking him straight whether he's in communion with the Roman See, and for the cause or reason of his application to me. We shall see what he says. Meanwhile, I'd be glad to hear how the imbroglio strikes you." Corvo showed more common sense when dealing with this affair than on any other occasions in his strange career. Very wisely he declined to be consecrated as a neo-Nestorian bishop for South India, and continued his literary work, which at that moment was profitable. Mar Jacobus, having failed to find the right man to raise to the episcopate for the benefit of his overseas flock, set to work on a liturgy for his small following at home. The Holy Sacrifice and Communion of the Lord's Supper, or Eucharist, was published in 1905. The book contained musical settings for this new and novel rite, also a lengthy version of Vespers, based on the order for evensong in the Book of Common Prayer. No doubt because the Nestorian books are in a bewildering state of confusion, Mar Jacobus did not feel bound to adhere closely to the Chaldean rite, which incidentally does not contain the words of institution in its canon. He continued to be more than hopeful of a great future for his evangelical Catholic Church, which he said was in communion with the Patriarch and Catholicos of the East, and tried to infiltrate it on the continent of Europe as an alternative to Roman Catholicism. This brought him into touch with Hyacinth Loyson, the ex-French Carmelite, then living with his wife at Geneva. There is a story that Hereford and Madame Loyson tried and failed to prevent Miraglia Gulotti of the Vilat succession from consecrating the magician and occultist Jules Hoisset as first metropolitan of the Gallican Church. It is possible that by the early autumn of 1904, Bishop Hereford had found and consecrated a coadjutor to assist him with his worldwide apostolate, if what Madame Loyson wrote on October 14, 1904 is true. If you or your coadjutor returns to India and go by the Manaim maritime line, I think, get you reduced fares. Before the Corvo incident just mentioned, there was a suspicious character hanging around Oxford, who usually called himself Apostolic Vicar of the Independent Catholic Church of Southern Switzerland, and who gave his name as Count Edward Ruffin Benedict Donkin. Very little is known for certain about his past, and it is difficult to distinguish between what is truth and what fiction in stories told about him. One tale is that Donkin had been a Benedictine monk in the United States, and that in the summer of 1899, having broken away from the Catholic Church, he was sent to Mexico at the expense of some American Protestants to congratulate Monsignor Eduardo Sanchez Camacho on his brave efforts to form a national church and to assure him of their support. This prelate had been Bishop of Tamaulipas since 1880, but he had been forced to resign his see in 1896, when he retired into private life. After this, he started to publish articles defamatory of Monsignor Alarcon, Archbishop of Mexico. A second tale is that Donkin used to say that at some time or other he had been ordained priest by Vilat, and that on November 30th, 1902, he had been raised to the episcopate by a Syro-Chaldean bishop in South India. Later on, he produced papers giving the witnesses of his consecration or reconsecration by Monsignor Sanchez Camacho in the chapel of Amadeus of Savoy at Naples. What was missing, however, was the papal mandate authorizing this consecration for an autocephalous church. There is yet another strange story that Bishop Donkin preached in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Paris, before he returned to England from Switzerland to meet the charges of fraudulent dealings made against him. How this ubiquitous adventurer managed to get on suitable terms with Mar Jacobus and persuaded him to undergo a second consecration from his hands is unknown, but it is believed the secret consecration took place in August 1904. All Hereford's biographer can say is that he had no doubts whatsoever whatsoever about his consecration by Mar Basilius, for which reason this reconsecration must have been accepted from some honest personal motive. What we do know is that the titular bishop of Santa Croce in Sicily, as Duncan also styled himself, was a somewhat troublous and disruptive influence at Percy Street, and that Hereford naturally felt rather sensitive about this secret consecration, and never alluded to the matter after. Duncan remained at Oxford for some time, but we are told that Hereford only occasionally came into contact with him on personal affairs. This is not surprising, because on June 27, 1905, Madame Loyson, who had known Duncan in Switzerland, wrote, "More than we can tell, we are sorrowful, Père Hyacinth and I, that you were induced to receive reconsecration from anyone, and especially from such a villain, as this throws doubt on your first consecration. The consequence is disastrous. In the name of Père Hyacinth and my own, I express our most Christian sympathy, praying God to lead you where men misled, and to help you to go forward doing a good work. It is improbable that Mar Jacobus felt it necessary to obtain a special dispensation from the Patriarch of Sallustia Sestiphon, Babylon, before he married Miss Alice M. Scarrett of Hove on the feast of St. Anthony the Abbot, January 17, 1907. This wealthy lady was some years his senior, although she was never received into the Nestorian Church and remained in communion with Canterbury throughout her life. She shared her Episcopal husband's enthusiasm for animal welfare and became joint secretary of the Oxford Anti-Vivisection Society. The Herefords had no children, but always maintained a large family of cats. For the next 20 years, the Bishop of Murcia and his wife led very busy lives. There were few societies in Oxford which they did not join if they felt it would benefit animals or human beings in one way or another. The bishop himself became a familiar figure at conferences all over Britain, especially those of an ecumenical character. The Herefords eventually bought a house at 137 Banbury Road, Summertown, North Oxford. On Sundays, the bishop pontificated in the Evangelical Catholic Church in the Divine Love over Magdalen Bridge. The services included the Divine Liturgy Eucharist at 11 a.m. and Vespers at 6:30 p.m. There was at least one midweek benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, for the Mercian version of the Syro-Chaldean Rite, like the Malabarese Rite, had interpolated many Western elements. Guilds of St. Joseph and the Good Shepherd are said to have had a large membership. The British administrator of the Nestorian Church in India, Ceylon, Socotra, and Messina went around Oxford on his pedal bicycle, always busy with baptisms, confirmation classes, choir practices, visiting the sick, and hearing confessions. He seems to have made a fair number of converts, but does not appear to have compelled them to profess their belief in the Nestorian doctrine that there are two persons as well as two natures in Christ. So far as can be gathered, he himself remained a nebulous Unitarian. Those whose memories of Oxford go back half a century will recall the entertainment provided by this odd but lovable bishop with a humble little pro-cathedral off the Iffley Road, and how inquisitive Anglo-Catholic undergraduates sometimes attended the services there, though warned by the Cowley Fathers that by doing so they were guilty of schism. In fact, Hereford's churchmanship was nothing if not comprehensive. He was keenly interested in the English extension of Old Catholicism, and was on friendly terms with both Archbishop Matthew and Monsignor Beale, one of the two Roman Catholic priests who were consecrated by Matthew in June 1910. This excommunicated protonotary apostolic spent a few days with the Herefords that year. They also knew Monsignor Scott Hall, titular Bishop of Winchester, who had been raised to the episcopate by Matthew, and who was their neighbor in North Oxford, with a little schismatic chapel in a street near the railway station. On June 15, 1909, the Bishop of Murcia cycled from Brighton to Storrington, 19 miles each way, so that he could assist at the funeral of George Tyrrell, the excommunicated Jesuit. By this time, he appears to have been in frequent contact with Baron von Hugel and other leading modernists in England. The Evangelical Catholic Church, the name by which Hereford's sect was generally known, obtained some publicity in April 1913, when Mar Jacobus marched through the streets of Oxford, vested in the robes of a prelate in the Latin Rite, which he favored to those of the Syro-Chaldean Rite. He wanted to show his sympathy with the tramway employees who were on strike. It was about this time that he encouraged R.J. Campbell, minister of the City Temple, to form an order of nonconformist pioneer preachers. It was also in 1913 that the Herefords moved to Elmswood, Lothbury Road, North Oxford. The Church of the Divine Love was sold, and a new chapel opened in Howard Street. A domestic oratory alongside Elmswood was opened to the public. It was furnished with Western-style pipe organ and two Eastern-style icons of the prophet Elias and St. Gregory Thaumaturgus, neither of whom was Nestorian. It was typical of Hereford's eclectic Unitarianism that he should adorn his private chapel with an icon of this 3rd century Greek church father, who is the author of a Trinitarian exposition of belief. However, the inconsistency was not noticed by the average worshiper, and these oriental decorative features helped to remind people that this honest place of worship claimed to be under the somewhat remote jurisdiction of the Syro-Chaldean Patriarch of Babylon, and was not in communion with the Diocese of Oxford. During the First World War, the Bishop of Murcia was an ardent pacifist, supporting conscientious objectors, and quite prepared to go to prison himself if needs be. On May 15, 1915, he celebrated for the first time his vernacular version of the 4th century Egyptian liturgy of Saint Serapion, Bishop of Thmuis in the Nile Delta. Another important landmark in the career of Mar Jacobus was recorded in November 1916, when he conditionally baptized and confirmed William Edwin Orchard, the Congregationalist minister, who between 1914 and 1932 rose to national fame at the King's Way House, London. Orchard was ordained priest by Hereford in 1916, being anxious to possess authority to celebrate the Eucharist as a propitiatory sacrifice, while still continuing his free church ministry. But as he explained in his autobiography of religious development, written after he was received into the Roman Church in 1932, it was soon made obvious, however, that this step was taken without sufficient inquiry into the issues involved, or with adequate consideration of the consequences, and it proved a cause of much unhappiness and misunderstanding. Mar Jacobus had been drawn to this West End Congregationalist conventicle not only because of its exotic ritualism, but by reason of its being a pacifist outpost during World War I. Its red banner, inscribed "For Faith, Justice, and Peace," was raised in Trafalgar Square at Christmas 1916. The congregation of this unconventional place of worship in the heart of Mayfair included almost every variety of reduced Christianity, embracing some whose leanings were towards theosophy or spiritism, the Baha'i movement, founded by Baha'u'llah in Persia, which evolved from Babism and which taught world brotherhood on a spiritual basis, had been allowed to meet on the premises. In a room at the top of the building there were actually discovered small pylons and a chest containing enigmatic objects, which it would only be concluded had been used for the worship of Osiris, the best beloved god, or some other resurrected esoteric Egyptian deity. Also associated with this legally Congregationalist chapel was the so-called Society of Free Catholics. Most of its members were free church ministers who were striving to transform nonconformist religion into something closer to Catholicism in faith and worship. The president was the Reverend J.M. Lloyd Thomas, a Unitarian minister at the Old Meeting House, Birmingham. An elaborate and expensive structure on which the Chamberlain family had lavished their ample funds, he is remembered as a personality of considerable force whose courage and energy were united with gifts of far vision and great practical statesmanship. Under the joint control of Dr. Orchard and Mr. Lloyd Thomas, the society increased its influence. Bishop Hereford did all in his power to encourage these liturgical pioneers, placing at their disposal his somewhat in-choate knowledge of Christian worship. A magazine, The Free Catholic, propagated the objects of the society, which was finally dissolved in 1928. Thanks to Dr. Orchard's persuasive powers as a preacher, it did not take long to convert the King's Way House congregation to the substance of Catholic ceremonies. Within a few years, they had got used to altar lights, vestments, incense, reservation in an aumbry, mass celebrated according to various rites, and benediction at least every Sunday evening. Eventually, Mar Jacobus supplied the King's Way House with a second priest and 3 deacons, who, like Dr. Orchard, were convinced that they had obtained valid orders. With a staff of 5 clerics, it was possible to provide a dignified high mass. On Sundays, at feast days, in the elliptical auditorium of Sir Alfred Waterhouse's Neo-Byzantine Romanesque chapel, to which Sir John Burnet had added a chapel about 1901. The worshippers included lapsed Anglicans, dissatisfied Methodists, and even a few dissatisfied Roman Catholics. Dr. Orchard maintained that he could feel the presence of the Blessed Sacrament in any church, and was surprised when people suggested that this might be a merely subjective emotionalism. This did not matter, however, because neither the nearby Anglo-Catholic Grosvenor Chapel nor the Jesuits at Farm Street Church could rival the King's Way House in ritual and ceremonial. Its ministers liked to boast that, thanks to the Bishop of Murcia, both the Roman and Eastern churches recognized the validity of the masses they celebrated, even if the source of the orders obtained was admittedly somewhat irregular. How these deacons and priests managed to obtain their valid orders from Mar Jacobus has been described by the Reverend W. Rowland Jones in his Diary of a Misfit Priest. He had received Anglican orders from Dr. Hensley Henson, Bishop of Durham, and after holding curacies in 4 parishes, was invited by Dr. Orchard to join the staff of the King's Way House.